everybody, and welcome back to the OMB Report Live, where I talk about the news in both a critical and a cynical fashion from a Catholic independent perspective. Thank you, everyone, for joining me this morning. It's been really fun to do this summer series. Really hope I can continue to do this series once the school year starts back, which is really just a few weeks away, which is kind of crazy how quickly the summer has gone away from me this year, especially being stay-at-home dad for the summer. Being a teacher and having the summers off, obviously, financially makes sense to do so. Obviously, also building the relationship with my son makes sense to do so as well. But it would be not truthful for me to say that there are a lot of things that I really wanted to be able to do this summer and focus on this summer that I've not really been able to do, and also things that I think I have been guilty of making excuses for not being able to do as well. But one thing that I do really want to continue throughout the year as the school year starts is some variation of the OMB Report Live, or at least videos for the OMB Report channel, because there are so many things going on in the world constantly, not just in the secular world, but most especially in the church as well. We've seen already this past year and a half with the lockdowns, right? Not only did we have unconstitutional lockdowns take place at the secular level, we also had downright damning shutdowns happen at the church level as well. Bishops and shepherds of the church abandoning their flocks, withholding the sacraments, withholding the graces of the sacraments to their flock. So we've seen this at both the state and church level, and it really is sad and it really is disturbing. But with all that being said, there are a couple of things for us to talk about today. One is, of course, there is a huge protest/revolution going on right now in Cuba, and to no one's surprise, the mainstream media and many of their allies are pointing the finger back at the United States, saying, well, it's partially the United States that's to blame for the conditions going on in Cuba. And then, of course, they would like to blame anyone and everyone except for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and anyone else who's currently in charge of the government or has a D next to their name, unless somehow they've been canceled for one reason or another. We'll also talk a little bit about what's going on in France, where, to again, more and more insanity in this COVID-19 world, this COVID-19 scaredemic that we are still existing in. They have essentially tried to indicate they were going to mandate vaccinations for the country and also implement a type of vaccine passport. And all I can say is thank the Lord, thank God, that many people in that country have been inspired to fight, against the tyranny, have been inspired to fight against the dictatorship, essentially, that is going on right now in places like France and Cuba. Cuba, of course, being so in a communist regime for many, many years. France, even though it would call itself anything but communist, anything but dictatorship, with the lockdowns and now with the attempt to try and force a vaccine passport of sorts and force vaccines upon people. Yeah. Not to mention, of course, here in the United States, we now have the infamous Dr. Fauci once again opening up his dang mouth and spouting nonsense, saying that kids, if you're 3 years old or older, that you have to wear a mask. Even though, I can't do that voice forever, but even though they are not allowing vaccines for young children, I wonder why. Could it be because there are side effects? By the way, for everyone's disclosure, I am not a doctor or medical expert. However, we do know that there are several reports that say, they have to, for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they are now putting a warning label on that vaccine saying there is going to be a higher risk of getting certain conditions. So, if this vaccine then is so safe and so wonderful, why is it that we don't let it happen and be given to our children? It's a fair question to ask. It's not falling into conspiracy territory or conspiracy theory territory. It's a good question. It's like, if these things are so safe and so effective, why is it that it's not open to everyone? if we have these giant stockpiles of vaccines because there's a lot of people that are still skeptical about their efficacy, that are still skeptical about their origin. I've mentioned this before. There is a clear religious exemption from a Catholic Christian perspective because every single vaccine publicly available right now in emergency use has been developed from and has used aborted fetal tissue. That is a verifiable fact. We can actually date the year in which that child was aborted. So we can actually have it with that kind of accuracy to know that is the case. But yet, we can't have this given to our children. And so Dr. Fauci is going to come out and say that's why they need to wear a mask, since they can't be vaccinated. And here's the other thing, too, is that he also spouts the nonsense of, well, the reason why is because you need to protect people. What about if they've already been vaccinated? What if the only people left are young and healthy people who have very low risk factors of getting it or having effects from it or let alone dying from it, and the only people left are those that have been vaccinated? Well, you still got to protect them because the vaccines are not 100% effective. That's not how this works. It's like, okay, then why are we going out of our way to try and inoculate the entire population? Why are we going out of our way, especially as new variants, stronger variants, more fast-spreading variants, where the vaccines currently available only have a, 50% efficacy, 60% efficacy? I'm not a doctor. I'm just simply reporting on what has been reported, even by the mainstream shill media. But oh no, can't talk about that. Can't badmouth Dr. Fauci. Not to mention, if we're talking about idols, y'all heard this news story about how lightning literally struck a George Floyd memorial, destroying it. I don't know what else needs to happen in our world for us to kind of start to wonder, even for those that are skeptical, even for those that are not of faith, to say, how is it that lightning, of all the places that it could have struck, because obviously it strikes at random, right? You can't really predict where lightning is going to strike, let alone, lightning striking twice, that kind of thing. The fact that lightning would strike a George Floyd memorial enough to destroy it. I mean, you don't see a sign there. You don't see the destruction of an idol in that instance, because I certainly do. Because despite what anyone thinks about George Floyd, not even getting into that, there's no denial that George Floyd has been turned into an idol. And no one, let alone George Floyd, should be turned into an idol. But we can't have these conversations. We're not allowed to have these conversations. We're not allowed to have these questions. It's insane that we live in a world today that claims science, 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 trust the science, but then at the same time, through the other side of their mouth, they say, don't question, don't ask, don't study, don't do anything, which is the antithesis of scientific discovery. Anyway, mini rant out of the way. Let's go ahead and say hello to some people in the chat. What is going on, everybody? If you're on YouTube, make sure you smash that like button, please. It really does mean a lot. Also, we're live over on Odyssey. Biffer the Hobbit, what is going on, good sir? Biffer says, hello, hashtag free Britney. Yeah, that story obviously is still going on right now, where last time I heard, the courts are not allowing her to have any sense of autonomy back in her life. Remember that this woman has been forced to have an IUD put into her body so that she cannot have children. Keep in mind, an IUD is not just, and again, I'm not a medical doctor, just pointing out how things work. An IUD is not just a spermicide, right? An IUD partially makes it difficult for the sperm to reach the egg, to create fertilization, etc. But what it also does is if that sperm and egg do meet, it does not allow for implantation to occur, which means that an IUD is an abortifacient, meaning that an IUD leads to a fertilized egg being aborted from the human body, destroyed. So we live in a world where a woman who clearly had a mental break, we saw this happen very clearly, but we live in a world where someone, anyone, can have something forced into their body, which leads to the destruction of human life, and people don't bat an eye, and people defend it, and our courts which are supposed to be the arbiters of truth, which are supposed to be the defenders of laws and order, are supposed to be the defenders of our freedoms, tell Brittany, no, you don't have that freedom. Sorry. Nope. Too bad. We're going to allow this to continue. No, you can't have a family, even though you want one. My body, my choice. My body, my choice. That only applies to certain cases. That only applies to certain things. And then you come back with the whole vaccine. Well, my body, my choice. Well, it's not the same thing. Oh, okay. See how the goalposts are always constantly moving here? It's insane. It's ridiculous. We live in an insane world today. But Bifford Hobbit, thank you for watching over on Odyssey. If you're watching on Odyssey, make sure you light up that fire button, and I will do my very best to keep up with the Odyssey chat. And again, if you're on YouTube, thank y'all for being here. Remember, if you have a comment or question, please put @Odin at the very beginning of your comment, @Odin, and it'll let me know that you're trying to get my attention. Also, please make sure to like and share this video wherever you are, because Lord knows YouTube is going to suppress it to the very best of its ability, even though I officially am eligible again for monetization. So I clicked the reapply button. Probably will get word very quickly that it's going to be denied. But hey, that's okay. I do this channel specifically because I like talking about these issues, because I think it's important to talk about these issues, especially when other people won't. And there's a reason why I stream multi-stream to YouTube, to Periscope, to DLive, to Odyssey, because if YouTube doesn't like it, hey, I'm still going to be live. In the great words from one of the greatest films of all time, in my opinion, Serenity, one of the great sci-fi films of all time, Serenity, you can't stop the signal. You can't stop the signal. Anyway, what's going on YouTube? Peeps, we got Rodrigo. What's going on, Rodrigo? Ricardo says, Deus Vult. Absolutely. God wills it. Hail to you, good sir. Hound 3000 in the chat. What's going on? We got ZK Man. What's going on, good sir? What's up? JKDVX76. What's going on? How is it going? Glad to have you back here. Mutant Banhammer. What's going on? Thank you for being here this morning. Also, please do remember that there are no memberships here on this YouTube channel. So if you're used to having comments just read aloud because you are a member, again, for this channel, you have to put @Odin at the very beginning of your comment, because it really just does help out a lot. M-Tax Shark, what's going on? Glad to have you here. And commenting is dangerous. Thank you for being here today, Goblin Squatch. And Goblin Squatch, and any other person that is currently on locals or thinking about supporting on locals, I'm going to try the very best I can to start getting some stuff up. I know I got to get the podcast Q&A up, because John Flickinger and I are going to be doing a Q&A podcast very, very soon. He is in the process of moving, and if you know anything about John, you know that sometimes he moves slow as molasses, for lack of a better expression. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about some of these stories as we wait for some people to get back. So let's talk about this first one. This is from the LA Times, which I'm sure, LA Times, oh yeah, it's going to give a fair assessment. I'm sure it's going to give a fair assessment of what's going on in Cuba, I bet. And yes, the doggos are indeed present here today with me, as baby Thor is still sick and still sleeping. Hopefully, he'll start to turn around today, so that way he can go to daycare at least once this week. If not, then praying that he'll get well over the weekend, so that way we can get him back in daycare, because there's just a lot of things I really want to be able to try and do during these last couple of weeks of summer vacation, because I really haven't had much of a summer vacation. I had a few days last week of summer vacation where I was able to actually go out to a movie and go to different places that I needed to go to. I really want to do a Best Buy run at some point, because there's some Blu-rays and Steelbooks I want to check out. Obviously, I want to play around with my little hopefully my very subtle spy camera, so that way I don't get yelled at next time. But anyway, that's for the OMB Reviews channel. Let's go ahead and dive into this news and politics stories for the day. So the first one is from the LA Times, the bastion of truth of LA, the LA Times. It says here, Cuba's leader says the government failings played a role in protests. This is from the AP. Don't you always love when these newspapers are picking up AP stories and then they're writing it as their own? It's amazing to me how much the pandemic has really kind of exposed the way in which the news media works. I mean, a lot of us have been aware of it for a long time, but it's amazing how much more they've exposed themselves as all basically regurgitating their own information so that they can then cite one another. And then it creates this sense of seriousness, it creates this sense of credibility, because then they can say, well, according to the New York Times or according to this or that, but then you go back to the original source and you're like, wait a minute, this is not really the best way. Anyway, it says here, Cuba's leader for the first time offered some self-criticism in an address acknowledging that government shortcomings in handling shortages and other problems played a role in this week's protest, whose scale and intensity caught many by surprise. Is he going to take responsibility for communism failing? For people not wanting communism in their country? I bet not. But in a televised speech Wednesday night, President Miguel Diaz-Canel, President, that's a fun title to call yourself, also called on Cubans not to act with hate, a reference to the violence that occurred at some of the demonstrations in which protesters voiced grievances over high prices, food shortages, and power outages. Some even called for a change in the government. Now, here's the thing. Personally, I am not for violence. I'm very much a pacifistic person. I don't like war. I don't like violence. I understand that there are a lot of people who are going to disagree with me on that point, who are going to say, hey, I at the very least support violence, revolution when it is overthrowing a tyrannical government, and I understand that. For me, though, I even in those cases, I still personally, it's hard for me. It's really, really hard for me to be supportive of violence. It's just not something within me, right? And that's obviously something that I myself have to deal with. But yeah, they even mentioned, some even called for a change of government. So notice how they connect. Stopping the voice of hatred, right, of violence, and then they connect it with the change of government. You can kind of see the way in which they're going to try and frame this in a pretty clear fashion. So anyway, it says, before Diaz-Canel's address, the government had blamed social media. Yeah, here's where the part that really was ridiculous came into play. It says the government had blamed social media and the United States for last weekend's protests, the biggest in Cuba in a quarter century. Since the time when then so-called President Fidel Castro waded into the streets to calm thousands of people furious over dire shortages following the collapse of the Soviet Union and its economic subsidies for the island. Yes, because communism doesn't work. Because communism is evil. The Catholic Church has been very clear on this point. Communism is an intrinsically evil system, where power is very much collected at the very top and the rights of the human person are not respected. On Wednesday, Diaz-Canel said failings by the state played a role in the unrest. So notice they start off by saying it's social media's fault. It's the U.S. government's fault. And then only after the fact, we had a role to play. Yeah, maybe we had a small role to play. Maybe it's slightly our fault. Maybe it's slightly our fault here. It says here, we have to gain experience from the disturbances, he said. We also have to carry out a critical analysis of our problems in order to act and overcome and avoid the repetition. Analyze our problems to act, overcome, and avoid the repetition. So you mean lock up political prisoners? You mean shut down speech? Shut down social media platforms so that way this doesn't happen again? You blamed social media and the federal government of the United States before yourselves. So it seems to indicate that you're thinking part of the problem is outside of the country, having freedom sentiments being brought into the country. Can't have that. Got to overcome that. Got to stamp that out from being repeated. It says here, in the protests, many Cubans expressed anger over long lines and shortages of food and medicines, as well as repeated electricity outages. Some demanded a faster pace of vaccination against COVID-19. But there were also calls for political change in a country governed by the Communist Party for some 6 decades. There it is. Notice how it kind of underplays that too. It says there were people first, though, talking about electricity outages and medicine and COVID-19. And then at the very end, there were also some calls, for an end to communism. It was kind of there too. COVID-19, that was a bigger issue. All these other things, much bigger issues. But yeah, communism, it wasn't as big of a deal. It's definitely how they're framing it, for sure. Notice again, they're not saying that, but they are framing it. And this is what the news media does. The news media is not just about the information they put in there, it's how they present it. It is how they frame it that makes a huge difference in the way that it's received. It says police arrested dozens of protesters, sometimes violently, underplaying that a bit too, and the government has accused demonstrators of looting and vandalizing shops. Smaller protests continued Monday, and officials reported at least one death. No incidents were reported on Wednesday. Oh, so what that tells me is that you've shut down these protests then. You've put that communist iron fist down then. Interesting. But again, don't you love how it says, oh, but there was looting and vandalizing? And again, I don't like violence. And if you're looting a shop, if you're vandalizing someone's home or someone's shop or anything like that, I'm not for that. I'm not okay with that. I am not in favor of that. But obviously you can see the LA Times is trying to frame it in this way where it's interesting how they're framing it, because I don't remember them being nearly as focused on these elements back last year when the Black Lives Matter protests were going on, right? They're the mostly peaceful protest. Remember, that's what we were told constantly, right? They were mostly peaceful protests. And I'm going to be the first to admit to it. I would say that if you look at the actual raw numbers of people protesting versus the raw numbers of people being violent, based on numbers, you could probably argue that point, that the vast majority of people present didn't act violently. But the way in which the media presents the information is very clearly an attempt to try and downplay those acts of violence. Instead of saying there were protests where there were several incidents of violence that broke out, which would have been a much more accurate way of presenting it, they instead framed it to say they were mostly peaceful and they were just a couple of ragamuffin, right? They were just a couple of people. When obviously we know it was billions of dollars worth of damage, which is a lot more than what many people would want to actually put out there. It says here, quote, "Our society is not a society that generates hatred, and those people acted with hatred." Oh, people protesting acting with hatred. "The feeling of Cubans is a feeling of solidarity. And these people carried out these armed acts with vandalism, yelling for deaths, planning to raid public places, breaking, robbing, throwing stones." What did your government do? Diaz-Canel? What did your police force do? Of which we have video footage of. To even journalists covering it. There's this really creepy video of this one woman who was covering events on the ground where they break into her house and they arrest her. All caught. Not to mention trying to shut down internet and the ability for people to get information out from that country. That's communism, everybody. Authorities did not report the number of people arrested. Why would they? Because then you'd have to do the math on how many of them get released or prosecuted, and then you'd realize, oh wait, that one reported death, interesting. But of course they won't. Colonel Moriyama Bravet of the Interior Ministry said only that most were between the ages of 25 and 37, so young people, saying, "We don't want the government of our fathers and grandfathers. We want freedom. Communism is not freedom. And would be prosecuted for such crimes as, here we go, public disorder, assault, contempt, robbery, and damage." Okay, assault, robbery, damage, those make sense. Public disorder, contempt, what does it even mean? To be, does that mean having contempt towards the Communist Party? Is this saying that you can be arrested in Cuba and you can be in jail, you can be put in jail and in prison in Cuba for having contempt against a communist regime? I mean, I know that's what it means. Does the LA Times and other news media know that's what it means? Cuba is suffering its worst crisis in years from a combination, oh, here it goes, LA Times, here it goes, from a combination of inefficiencies in the state-run economy, the tightening of U.S. sanctions on the island, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which has paralyzed the economy, including the vital tourism industry. The Trump administration imposed more than 200 measures against the island in 4 years. There we go. It's Trump's fault, everybody. Yeah, there was a state-run economy that was, had some inefficiencies to it, right? And then, of course, COVID-19, gotta blame that too. But remember, when we say tightening of U.S. sanctions, what we mean is not Biden. What we mean is Trump. Trump is the reason why. Trump is the evil one here. Diaz-Canel said this is a complex situation. Oh, I bet it is, Diaz. Was taken advantage of, quote, by those who do not really want the Cuban Revolution to develop or a civilized relationship with respect to the United States. Really? Really? Oh, by those who don't want the Cuban Revolution to develop? See, the only Cuban Revolution that's going to be allowed to develop is continued communism. If you have thousands of people out in the streets protesting and wanting regime change, and what they want is no longer communism, you won't view that as being legitimate, because that would mean that you would lose your power. So don't for a second try and say, this is an advantage. People are trying to take advantage of this situation. People are trying to take advantage of this. It goes on to say, shortly before the president's remarks, Prime Minister Manuel Marrero announced some measures such as customs flexibility for Cuban citizens who go on foreign trips to bring home toiletries, food, and medicines, which are among the most hard-to-find items in Cuba. I wonder why. Could it be because of communism? Marrero also said that work was being done to improve the stability of the national electricity system, and that officials would seek to improve the supplies of medicines, many of which are produced on the island, but whose inputs must be imported. Remember when there was a film that came out, a documentary that came out not too long ago, within the last 20 years, and it was Michael Moore going to Cuba saying, look how amazing Cuba is. Look how amazing Cuba is. They've got such great healthcare. They've got such great everything. The age of social media, everybody. Because even when a government tries to shut things down, as I've said, you can't stop the signal. You can't stop it. It says then, meanwhile, Economy Minister Alejandro Gil announced that directors of state-owned enterprises would be allowed to determine salaries beyond the regulations. He also said in the coming weeks, long-promised rules would be instituted for small and medium-sized enterprises to be formed, a step once unthinkable under the communist government. So notice how they're giving credit to the communist government there at the very end. Oh, there's going to be small and medium-sized enterprises being formed. This used to be thought unheard of in communism, but look at the amazing stuff they're doing. All the while pointing out, again, state-owned enterprises. Maybe that is the issue, LA Times. Maybe the issue is the fact that you have a bunch of state-run groups and not a private sector. Because notice how in the United States, even though we have, I think, taken a lot of steps more so into the direction of socialism. I mean, we've already seen socialistic steps taken in our government, especially in the last 20 years. We've seen huge pushes in that direction in the last 20 years. You, at the very least, do have private industry here. Notice how during the pandemic, the only reason why the economy suffered, the only reason why any of this stuff had a negative impact on a lot of people was because the government forced businesses to shut down. Government is the problem. It was very clear during the pandemic here in the United States. It's even more clear in countries like Cuba, where you have a completely or almost completely state-run economy. Why do you think you have shortages of food? At the very least here in the United States, we didn't really have that. We had shortages of toilet paper. We had shortages of gas for a while. But in the end, we were able to make do and we were able to overcome because of private business. But the LA Times, notice, it tries to play itself off as being a news agency, right? This is the World Nation. This is from the AP, right? It's from the Associated Press. It's supposed to be all fair and it's supposed to be all balanced and everything like that. But in the end, what is it? It's giving excuses to Cuba. It's giving excuses to communism. If they actually wanted to be legitimate, they would be saying, this is the fault of communism. They would actually be calling it out. But we live in a world today where so many of these people, so many of these so-called reporters, so many of these so-called investigators have all been put through the liberal academia machine that is higher education in the collegiate level, where they have been indoctrinated by the works of Karl Marx, where they have been indoctrinated by so many far left leaders, so that they look at this and they say, well, it's clearly not communism's fault. It's clearly not communism's fault. and they will continue to blame people like Donald Trump, who, remember, has not been in office for a long time now. Anyway, that is the first story. Let's go ahead and see what's going on. Odyssey, thank y'all for lighting up that fire button. Not seeing much discussion over there, but thank y'all for being here nonetheless. Let's head back over to the YouTube chat. Thank you again, YouTube fam, for being here today. Let's see. Mark Oquist. Yeah, he is always in the process of moving. That is very true. I hope that he settles down one day. JKDBuck76 comes in to say, if you need to not stream in the morning so you can go enjoy a day off, then please do so. None of us want you to burn out, brother. No, actually, to be honest, these streams are very much a good outlet. They're very much a good outlet for me because they allow me to express frustration, right? To get some emotions off the chest, that kind of thing. So actually, these streams are actually very, very helpful. My anxiety and stress comes more between transition periods. And something that I figured out about myself is that when things don't go according to plans, that is typically when my anxiety and when my stress levels, go up. And that's something obviously I need to work on. But yeah, these are not the types of things that have a negative impact on me. All right, Rodrigo come here to say, regardless of anyone's opinion of Trump, he at the very least was to a fair degree successful at revealing the fake news media to the masses. Well, at the very least, he would call them out. Right, regardless of what anyone says about President Trump, people at the end of the day have to, I think, respect him for the fact that he didn't let the media do any of their spin. Now, obviously, there are going to be times when he was very abrasive, and that's just, again, something that I'm personally not a fan of because I don't like conflict in general. Conflict makes me personally uncomfortable. However, he did call them out, and he did say, look at what you're doing right now. And he would be able to point out specifically exactly how they were spinning the story, exactly how they were showing a bias. Rodrigo then, of course, says, don't forget Catholic theory of just war. Yeah, just war theory. Here's the issue, though, with that, Rodrigo. If you look to just war theory, there are several conditions that have to be present, and you can't ever have really a completely from beginning to end just war. Go even back to World War II, and you start to realize that there are parts of the war that very much fulfilled the conditions, but there's other parts where those conditions really were not filled. So the issue with just war is that it's a very rare thing for all of the conditions to actually be filled, let alone for them to be sustained. So yeah, just war theory, is obviously, it's a Catholic principle, but it is a lot more complicated than some people would say. All right, Laura Story, welcome back, Laura. Glad to have you in the chat. Thank you for being here. I know it's very early where you are. Mike Jackson, welcome to the chat. Thank you very much for being here. Mike Jackson coming in right now to, let me see, just making sure. Sometimes I get notifications. I want to make sure that it's not anything that I need to jump off stream for, but luckily everything is okay. As apparently John is alive. He went to go see Space Jam: A New Legacy. I guess he got an early screening. Why would he want to watch that nonsense? But anyway, Mike Jackson says, having contempt with hatred, execution at 1800. Do you want to know more? I mean, yeah, it's crazy to think that they were able to mention that line, that one of the things that they were being accused of was contempt. Like, you're arrested for contempt? It's one thing to have contempt in court, right? There's certain, protocols that you're following and showing disrespect. Even then, I'm like, I think sometimes that can be overused. But to say that someone shows public contempt and that is a crime, that's ridiculous. But again, it makes total sense when you are in a communist regime. JKD Buck says, we know Biden and his authoritarian left are evil because they are literally making us 1984. Wrong think, wrong speak. I mean, I think there is a lot to be said for the current political discourse that we are in right now. We live in a country now where you are considered a bigot, where it is considered hate speech just to point out simple biological fact. To point out biological fact makes you a hateful bigot. That's ridiculous. Soul Extraction, good morning to you. All right, Rodrigo. Tag and says, I'm surprised that we haven't liberated Cuba yet. Tons of virgin coastline right next to Florida. Maybe the hotel lobby is too weak to pay the government to export our freedom for their own gain. Yeah, I mean, I think you also bring up a good point, Rodrigo, where, yeah, I am not into nation building. I don't want us to be the policemen of the world. What I want is the people right there, right now, protesting in Cuba. I want them, if that's what they want, to rise up to support that. And we need to have their backs. But that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is that our government, and as you can see, our media, is going to be pushing cover for the communist regime down there, just like we've done with other attempts at regime change in other countries in the Middle East. And that's only going to allow them to seize power and control, or to allow something much worse to come into its place. So yeah, I don't want us to send troops there. I don't want us to get involved in that way. At the very least, we should be like, no, we need to support and show support and talk about what's going on the ground, get people on the ground to cover the story. So again, not to push anything, not to try and push someone into power, because we've done that too many times in our history, and that is what creates problems. Instead, we need to show support to people pushing for freedom. We need to show support to people. We need to cover it, because if we can show the people of that country what is going on, and the people of the world what is going on, maybe, just maybe, we'll start to see a lot more people be more critical of communism when they actually see the harsh realities of it, even though we've already had a plethora of history to look at. But this is a modern day example. It's the same reason why we need to support people in China who are exposing the corruption, who are exposing what they are doing to the peoples over there, who are exposing the Uyghur concentration camps, who are exposing how they treated their own citizens during the COVID outbreak. Literally locking them in their homes, and not just locking them in their homes, but literally sealing them shut into their homes. That is the kind of stuff that needs to be talked about. That is the way, for me, change, that's the way, for me, I want change to happen from within, from the actual people themselves. And the only involvement that we have is to cover it, is to talk about it, and is to not allow any totalitarian governments or any totalitarian leaders to hide or suppress that information. Not through war, not through even sanctions or anything like that, because we all know sanctions do not hurt, in all honesty, the government. They're usually fine. Sanctions are typically going to be much more negative and much more harmful to the actual people. So I'm not really in favor of a lot more sanctions, to be honest. Instead, we should be like, hey, let's get people over there covering it on the ground with their own satellite systems. That way they can't get shut down. And let's expose what is actually going on. And let's make sure that everyone in that country, to the best of our ability, and at the very least in our country and around the world, knows exactly what is going on. Because there are so many Cuban Americans here in the United States, especially in Florida, who, if they can see what's going on, they're going to be a lot better suited to talk to their family members there, saying, here, this is what's going on. This is what is going on in your country right now. Do something. What are you going to do? Anyway. Buden Banhammer says, the Cuban Communist government refers to itself as the revolution, by the way. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm not an expert on Cuba, but isn't it interesting? Yeah, we need to protect the revolution, which is, of course, the Communist Party of Cuba. Ridiculous. All right, JKD Buck. For leftist rags like the LA Times, the Marxists in any country are never at fault. Or if they are, as the LA Times indicated, it's only a minor fault, right? Oh, there were some problems in the government, but we need to talk about all of these other things happening too. JKD Buck then says, Barack O'Blamer never ceases to blame his predecessor. Trump did the same, but not in the same extent as Barack. Here comes Joe Biden. Barack controls him remotely. We're in his third term. I don't know about the remote control necessarily, but I mean, to say obviously that we are in a very similar position, because yeah, Biden has very similar policy positions as Obama. There's no doubt about that. But actually, I will say this much. Biden's more radical than Obama ever was. And that's simply because the Democratic platform has become that much more radical since Obama was in office. And right now, it's not any longer an individual who's controlling anything. It's by party, right? It's by dictate. It's one of the reasons why I don't like political parties, because it's not people voting for a person to run the country. It's not voting for a person to stand in a place of power. It is voting for someone who is then going to allow for the party to dictate what happens. We are essentially in an oligarchical system. See, MTAC Shark says, totally agree with your nation-building point. This is an object lesson in the right of self-defense by the individuals. The people of Cuba have been disarmed by their so-called government. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I do support any act of self-defense. I do support that. I do support self-defense. I am not a fan of violence. However, if one is being attacked and threatened, one has a right to defend themselves. And I hope that there can be a way, because at the end of the day, if the people are brought to awareness and are educated on this, and that's going to take a lot of work because of the suppression of information by the government, which is, again, if we're going to be involved at all, it should be in making information available, not in creating propaganda, not in creating false narratives, but in actually saying, here's access. That's going to be the most powerful tool in all of this, is providing access to these people, saying, this is what's going on in your country. Are you okay with this, or are you not? Because the only way anything is going to change in that country and be long-standing change and be really authentic change is if it comes from within. Because, yeah, governments have a lot of power. Governments have, obviously, a lot of weapons and all these other things. But if that government is isolated, and if the people, a vast majority of that people, doesn't want it anymore, they can overthrow that government. I hope it can be as peaceful as possible. I hope there can be as limited violence as possible. But we know that the Communist Party, the communist regime, is not going to be quiet, is not going to quietly go away. And so if they're saying, hey, we want change, we want something to change in this, and they're going to try and then attack their citizens, the citizens at that point have a right to defend themselves. But it has to be done the right way. Anyway, let's head over to Odyssey. Thank you, Odyssey fan, for being here today as well. Beaver the Hobbit says, your thoughts on since June, there have been 45 attacks on Christian and mainly Catholic congregations. Of those, 17 of them have been scorched or burnt to a crisp in suspicious circumstances in Canada. What's going on with Canada right now in the Catholic Church is an abomination. It is despicable. Because for those that are not aware, it all stems from this false narrative being pushed that the Catholic Church in Canada is responsible for the deaths of natives in that country, which is a gross oversimplification of actually what happened. When you actually look at the information, when you actually look at the history of what they're talking about, it's the government actually that was the reason why you saw massive deaths. But of course, they're skipping that part of it and then just saying it's the responsibility of the Catholic Church. And so when you put that information out there, we saw this happen exactly with the United States last year. Why do you think people were going out into the streets, burning buildings, looting, causing violence during the Black Lives Matter protests? Because the media and the government were perpetuating lies. They were taking cases, not looking at full footage, not letting a court case go through, and indicting people on the spot, painting them as evil, painting them as the second coming of Satan, and they were then riling up people to act in a certain way. That's exactly what's happening in Canada right now. There is such an anti-Catholic sentiment right now going on in Canada. And what does that lead to? It leads to crazy people, extremists, going into action. Putting themselves into action. That's why we see what's going on right now in Canada. It's despicable, Biffer, is what it is. And it's sad. It really is sad. Because the churches up there are being blamed. The Catholic Church up there is being blamed for something that it was not responsible for. That it did not have a direct hand in whatsoever. But that's a part of the blame that we put on the media up there and, of course, the government up there for allowing these false narratives to be perpetuated. And obviously, when you look to countries like Canada, most especially Cuba, but even like Canada, which is far from being the place of freedom. Remember, Canada, there are still restrictions and lockdowns up there. Even though a Chinese communist-funded organization like the WHO has gone on record to say lockdowns don't work, Canada is still locking people down. That's what they're dealing right now with in Canada, which is why we need to see these types of pushbacks and these types of revolution across the world. Hopefully through nonviolent means, hopefully through peaceful means. Again, that's something I really do hope and pray is possible. All peaceful channels. Try to go through them as much as possible. Try and focus on those. And then only if there's no other option. If self-defense is the only option left and requires active self-defense, even then, right, for me personally, right, for my own prudential judgment, it's difficult for me to support or to become active or supportive of violence. That's just my own prudential judgment on that. Everyone else is going to have different judgments, especially the people of those countries, because they're the ones actively dealing with it. They're the ones actually being put into that situation. So only they can really know what's going on, and only they can really know what is going to be morally good and morally correct in that scenario. Because there's so much information that we're not getting. There's so much information that's likely being skewed in some way or the other. So we're really not in a good position to tell them exactly what they can or cannot do, or rather how they can or cannot do the things that they are seeking out. But we do see other countries across the world also starting to push back. So the second story of the day, so the last story of the day that I was going to officially talk about, is what's going on in France. Because France, obviously a much larger country in many ways, and one that is theoretically a freer nation as well, though I think that this story will kind of showcase how that's not the situation right now. But they are also seeing their own protests. And we're seeing obviously protests across various countries because of nonsense like this. But let's go ahead and talk about this. So as it says here, this is from theguardian.com, which I do like this one extension called Ground News, because it does give you a pretty good idea of where many of these places stand. So basically, The Guardian is a left-leaning organization. And it says that the bias is clearly left. And one thing about Ground News is that it gives you other sources that are covering similar stories. And obviously here for the LA Times, they must have it where it's blocked because it didn't pop up right away. But I would say anyone could easily see that it's a left-leaning organization. However, let's dive into the story. It says, France protests clashes with police on Bastille Day amid anger at tighter COVID rules. Demonstrations in Paris and other cities over plan for mandatory vaccinations for health workers and vaccine passes for public places. Police have fired tear gas to disperse demonstrators in Paris as thousands of people protested throughout France over new coronavirus restrictions. Based on that first line, tear gas, demonstrators. So tear gassing peaceful protesters? Now, obviously, I'm sure that we're going to have many indications and many mentions of people being violent, as you can see from that one image that's coming up down there of someone kicking in a window. I'm not okay with that. I'm not cool with that. I despise and I condemn any actions of violence in that way, especially towards individual businesses. But anyway, let's continue. Protests began in the French capital on Wednesday morning as the annual military parade for the traditional Bastille Day parade was taking place along the famous Champs-Élysées, again, I'm probably mispronouncing that terribly, watched by President Emmanuel Macron. The demonstrators are unhappy at the decision announced on Monday to oblige health workers to get vaccinated and bring in a vaccine health pass for most public places. Unvaccinated people would require, for example, a negative test result to enter restaurants. So first off, let's talk about that first thing. Forcing healthcare workers to get vaccinated. I'm going to say this. Most healthcare workers probably have already been vaccinated. Secondly, since we know that there are now 1,000 different strains of this virus, what we're up to, last time I think we were up to epsilon in the Greek alphabet. It's probably even gone past that now. And as every single variation of this virus happens, guess what? They also say, oh, the vaccines are this less effective. By the way, I am not a medical doctor. I got to make that very clear. I am not a medical doctor or a medical expert. I'm just telling you what has been reported by news media. Now, I'm not allowed to report it, but somehow they are. It's stuff like that that got my channel demonetized and videos taken down. But hey, if you're a trusted news media outlet, yeah, you can do whatever and say whatever it is that you want to say. But they want to force people who have probably already been vaccinated to receive a vaccine, which does have effects, which does have side effects. Again, that has been proven. And also, which is less effective to the point of some vaccines even being only about 50% effective against these new strains. So even from a logical standpoint, there really isn't a whole lot there. Let alone if you're a medical worker, if you're a health professional, you take so many steps already as far as like the PPE, right? As far as the protective gear that you wear, that the chances of transition of really anything is already going to be pretty difficult. But they want to force you to get a vaccine in this case. God help any of the people over in France who are part of the healthcare system. But the most egregious of all these, that's already bad enough. Again, forcing someone to get a vaccine. Any vaccine, for that matter. But then also now they're bringing in health passes. So in order for you to get into a restaurant, to eat food, essentially, you have to have a negative test. And for those that don't know and haven't heard about these health passports, this is something that's already been talked about for months and months and months. It's been implemented in some places. It's been talked about in some places. It's been revamped in some places. But essentially what it is it usually takes the place as an app on your phone. And in order to get into a place, you have to scan the app. You have to go up to a scanner, QR code type thing, scan it, and then it will tell whoever it is that's scanning it whether or not you are vaccinated, whether or not you have had a negative test in however long a period of time is concerned, and it's downright creepy. So that's basically what the health passport is. So in this instance, the political powers in France are saying, yes, in order for you to go to restaurants, in order for you to go out in public in general, to most places, you need to have a vaccine. And not just a vaccine, but also potentially a negative test result. Wouldn't be surprised if they're like, oh yeah, you need not only the vaccine, but also a negative test result. But also you need to have this passport. You need to have this app that proves ridiculous, insane. It says here, a protester tries to kick in window of a shop in Paris. Again, this is not cool. This is not okay. Now, based on the person, based on how he's dressed, this obviously seems like very much an Antifa type personality. Someone that just wants chaos. But hey, what am I to say? Since the announcement of record number of French people booked appointments for COVID-19 jabs, quote, "This is in the name of freedom," was the message from some of the protesters. In one area of the French capital, police fired tear gas to disperse the crowd. The declared route was not respected. The prefecture of police said in a tweet condemning the, quote, "throwing of projectiles and lighting of fires by the protesters." Again, I'm not okay with those types of acts of violence. Throughout Paris, some 2,250 people protested while other demonstrations took place in Toulouse, Bordeaux, Montpellier, Nantes, and elsewhere. The French authorities put the total number of protesters at 19,000. The French authorities. Yes, those trustful people who are trying to force people to get vaccines and also implement passports. Yes. Yes, I'm sure that they're going to give us an accurate number there. The Interior Ministry said there were altogether 53 different protests throughout France. Quote, "Down with dictatorship, down with the health pass," protesters chanted. One of them, Jan Fontaine, a 29-year-old notary's clerk from the Berry region in central France, said he had come to demonstrate in Paris, arguing that the imposition of a health pass equaled segregation. At the very least, I think that's the least truthful statement you can say about that. Macron plays on fears. It's revolting. I know people who will now get vaccinated just so that they can take their children to the movies, not to protect others from serious forms of COVID. And that's what they're doing. They are creating this and turning this into a completely political issue. It was already political beforehand, but now they're even more clearly turning it into a political issue. The French government on Tuesday defended its decision to impose COVID tests for unvaccinated people who want to eat in restaurants or take long-distance trips as the country looks to avoid a surge in the more contagious Delta cases. What about the Delta Plus cases? What about the Epsilon cases? Remember the Delta Plus case that a writer from Forbes was making jokes about because it's so super serial? Quote, there isn't any vaccine obligation. This is maximum inducement, government spokesman Gabriel Attal said to them. I have a hard time understanding in a country where 11 vaccines are already mandatory that this could be seen as a dictatorship, he said, adding that after a year of studying the vaccines, the time of doubting is long past. I'm sure those other vaccines were also put out in record time and were not put out through emergency use authorization and were not rushed through and were not after giving millions upon millions of dollars in advance to pharmaceutical companies. And yeah, I'm sure that none of that happened with those other vaccines, right? The time of doubting is long past, even though you yourselves admit, oh yeah, they're not as effective against these new variants, by the way. I'm not a doctor. I'm just reporting on what they've told us. Goes on, the rules will be relaxed for teenagers who have only been able to get jabs since mid-June. Quote, making summer hell is out of the question, Attal said. Okay, so you're making excuses and you're giving exceptions to certain people. See how contradictory this all is? Like, if this is so super serial and so super serial dangerous to the point of you having to really and actually limit the freedoms of other people in your country, and in some cases almost essentially force people to receive something that they don't necessarily want to receive, even if they, let's say you have a traditional Catholic in France who says, I'm not receiving any of these vaccines right now because none of them have been morally established. None of them have been morally manufactured, because that is the fact right now. There is not a single universal vaccine for COVID-19 that has been produced that has not in some way used aborted fetal cells. Hasn't happened yet. Hasn't happened. You want to know why? Maybe because those are the vaccines that are not getting millions and millions in dollars. So what does that mean? It means, oh yeah, those vaccines are going to take the traditional length, which is going to be probably a few years before they hit the open market. Isn't it kind of interesting how it's the abortion-tainted vaccines that got the most money, that got put out the most quickly, but the vaccines that are in development that didn't use aborted fetal cells, those are the ones that are in the background that are going to take a little bit longer? I don't know, just kind of a interesting anecdote there. Says, according to an Alab opinion poll published Tuesday, the new safety measure have a large majority of approval amongst French people. Of course it does. I'm sure it's a very trustworthy poll. Around 35.5 million people, almost half of France's population, have received at least one vaccine dose so far. Well, yeah, when your media and government are going to fearmonger you, you're going to do whatever it is that they say you're going to do because you don't know any better. We already see this in the United States and across the world, right? YouTube does not allow for differing opinions on any of this stuff about the efficacy or about the development of these vaccines. They shut you down. So it makes total sense to me that half of a country as large as France would have gotten the vaccine. But just because they've gotten it does not mean that they support these measures. At the start of the pandemic, France had some of the highest levels of vaccine skepticism in the developed world. And notice how at the very end there, it tries to say, oh no, everything's fine. Everything is totally fine. Ridiculous. All right. Let's go ahead back into the YouTube chat. JKD-Buck76 commenting to say, Christians being blamed is nothing new. They were blamed for Rome burning down. Yeah, absolutely. It was so bad. You know, some people don't make these connections. You know, you have those fireworks, and some people love playing around with them, called the Roman candle. People don't always recognize that, yeah, the Roman candle, you know that expression, you know where that came from? Oh, that's right. It came from Christians being burned alive to light the streets of Rome. Next time you buy a Roman candle, just remember that there's a firework named after the burning of human beings to light the streets of Rome. Oh yeah. It's been around for a long time. Just like there's been a lot of hatred towards Jews for a long time. Makes a lot of sense. Isn't it interesting how two of the most persecuted religious groups that have existed in history, Jews and Christians? I don't think it's that much of a coincidence at all. JM Cruz, I'm late, and what's happening out there is insane. It is indeed insane. What's going on, Andrew Hoyle? Yeah, we're going to wrap up in a few minutes. Baby Thor is still out. So so once I see him start moving, that's when I'll start to wrap things up. So we'll go on for a little bit more. All right, and those were the last of the comments that tagged me over there. And no new information over on Odyssey either. But yeah, what's going on right now in the world is truly insane, right? It's truly crazy. And it's sad because we live in a world where many people simply want to allow this type of nonsense to continue, simply want to allow this type of misinformation, this type of power grabbing to continue unfettered. There are people right now in news media rooms across the country looking at what's going on in Cuba saying, yeah, this is the reason why we need socialism. This is the reason why we need some of these principles in our own country. Like there were some offhand comments, I think it was Brian Stelter of reliable sources. He put out a comment saying, yeah, this has been a hallmark of communism, right? To shut down social media, to shut down disinformation. It's like, that okay, yeah. To shut down propaganda and misinformation. That is the hallmark of communism. Ah, yes, of course. When clearly we know that the purpose of communism and the purpose of them having so much power for them to shut down access to information is that they want to shut down any dissent. Why do you think the millions, the billion plus people population of China, why do you think they have not revolted? Why do you think you haven't seen any major protesting in China or major revolutions being planned in China or anything like that? Well, there's a couple of different reasons. For one, Chinese Communist Party controls the flow of information. So if you're in China, you only see what they want you to see. Add on top of that the fact that they have state-run schools, which are public schools, by the way, where they control also what information gets taught to the children. And one of the biggest things that gets taught to them is to be faithful to the Communist Party. So if you were born and raised your entire life thinking that you're in one of the greatest countries in the world and that your country's system is wonderful and is fantastic, and hey, the information you're being protected from, or hey, you don't even maybe know there's information that you don't have access to. How would you know that you're having information withheld from you when it's being withheld from you? And it's the reason why on my other channel, I've spoken highly of people like Chloe Zhao, who is the director of the upcoming Eternals movie. Not because I think the Eternals is going to be good, but because she was actually very honest with her experience in China. She said, yeah, I mean, I loved my childhood in that I love spending time with my dad, and there's a lot of really awesome things about Chinese culture, like an actual, like, of the old school Chinese culture. But walking the streets of China for her as a kid, she's like, you could just tell that you were living in, especially in her retrospective mindset, being out of China, that you were living in a lie, that you were living in a world surrounded by lies constantly. But that is exactly what the CNNs, the MSNBCs, even the Fox Newses. I mean, let's just be honest here. This is not just a left issue. This is not just a left issue. This is not just a Democrat issue. That's why I always say I'm an independent. I'm a Catholic independent mind, because I don't trust political parties. We can say one is better than another, but what does that even mean to say that? At the end of the day, what we need to do most especially, and I think JKD Buck has a great point in his comment right here, as Baby Thor is starting to wake up. So we'll go ahead and try and end things off here. Connor Williams, what's going on, man? JKD Buck, he goes on here to say, Odin, we need to pray more. I know that sounds trite, but that's what Jesus gave us. And if he prayed and said we needed to, then we need to. God, forgive me for not praying enough. Same here, man. That's something that I need to work on, something that I was hoping that I could work on this summer, and I allowed myself to make excuses. Right, I allowed myself to say, hey, taking care of Baby Thor has been a lot more difficult, and I had these things planned into my schedule, and I haven't been able to have them done. But that's just making an excuse. I mean, I can look back and say, look at all the movies that I've watched. And obviously the excuse I made was, well, it's because I was able to watch episodes and parts here and there and everything like that, and my mind is able to handle that. Whereas with prayer, I need to know I'm going to have a dedicated period of time for prayer. But again, that's making excuses. But you are completely correct there, JKD Buck 76. We do. We need to offer prayers more, but not just prayers. We also need to offer some mortifications as well. Right? Something that I need to do more of is fasting. Fasting, I think, periodic fasting, not just on days of obligation to do so, I think could also be very important as well. But also the other things too, right? Obviously prayer is important, right? Obviously prayer is important, especially for those of faith. But for those maybe who are not of faith, what else can we do? We can share stories. We can talk about this stuff. We can say, hey, I'm not trying to change your mind on this. I'm not trying to indoctrinate you on anything. I just want you to read this story. You know, when it comes to what's going on in Cuba and France right now, I want you to just be like, hey, here's what's going on. Here's actual footage on the ground. I know that you've probably heard something different from CNN or the New York Times or whatever it is that you're reading your information or consuming your information from, but here's actual raw footage, because we are getting actual footage on the ground from some of these countries, some of them which have tried to shut down the ability to send information out. So that's also something that we need to do as well, is we need to talk about these things. We need to bring these stories to the forefront, and we need to try and do the best that we can to spread it as far as we possibly can. Beaver the Hobbit over on Odyssey comes in to say, what is the one thing we're not talking about, but we really should be? I'm not exactly sure what was meant by that, but I think that just talking about these things and these stories, and you know, it really comes down to prudence, but also it comes down to how we speak to people, because it can be very easy, and I fall trapped to this and fall prey to this myself. It can be very easy to get so worked up about a lot of things where you immediately are like, how can you not see this, right? You're an idiot for not seeing it. But we fail to realize that talking in that way and in that tone to people that we really care about and we really want to have it and experience and to know the information that we have and we know to be true, that's not how you reach them. Because as soon as they feel that sense of tension or that sense of being degraded or anything like that, they shut off. So even if what you're telling them is true and compelling, it's the way in which it's presented that can ultimately be the difference maker. So that's also something that I think, for those of us of faith, we need to take to prayer. How can we best present this information? How can we best present these facts? How can we best present what's going on in a way that's going to hopefully open up the minds of others to fight back, and what that means to fight back, and the best way that we can, and the best path forward. But anyway, that's going to be it for me today, everybody. Again, thank you all so very much for supporting me today on this stream. Again, obviously a lot of stuff going on in Cuba. We need to pray for the people of Cuba. We need to pray that they are able to continue to have their voices be heard. We need to continue to pray that they are able to see the madness of what the system of government is in their country, to fight for freedom, to fight for it. And also we need to pray that others will support them in that. And we need to pray that we have the strength to be able to offer those prayers or other practical things that we can possibly do, whether it's sharing a story, sharing a video, sharing someone's personal account, whatever it is it might be. All of us are going to have something that we can do. Being calm, as it says right there from Goblin Squatch, commenting is dangerous. Agreed. Being calm, level-headed in cultural and political conversation takes a saintly level of self-control. It does. It absolutely does. That's why self-control is very much a virtue. You know, it's very much a virtue. It's called temperance. Temperance, self-control is such a difficult thing to do, but we need to be able to develop it. And the only way that we can develop it is through practice, because the virtues are in themselves habits of doing what is good and what is right. That's one that we especially need right now. I know I need to work on it, and I know that there's many others that need to work on it. But self-control and presenting what's going on right now in Cuba, what's going on right now in France, and in other parts of the world as well, right? There's protests that are popping up and have been going on consistently in various parts of the world. There's stuff going on in Australia. There's stuff going on in the UK, has been going on in the UK for a long time, in Ireland. We need to talk about it. We need to share it. And we need to try to be as level-headed as we possibly can in that process. But anyway, thank you all very much for being here today. It really does mean a lot. You guys are all amazing, beautiful people. Don't have any members to shout out because there are no members on this channel. We'll see what happens with the resubmitting of the monetization. But if you do want to support the channel, if you do want to support the work that I do or show appreciation, there's links in the description of how you can do that and ways you can do that. Obviously, there's no expectation, there's no obligation, but it is there if one wants to. But anyway, thank you all so very much for being there. Absolutely, the St. Michael's prayer, very important. Rodrigo, thank you for posting that in the chat. That could be a very powerful prayer, especially asking for the intercession of St. Michael, the intercession of Our Lady, the intercession of all the saints in heaven. Obviously, we need their help right now more than ever before. No doubt about it. But anyway, you guys are great. I thank you all so very much for being here and for your love and for your support. Odyssey fam, thank you for being here. YouTube fam, thank you for being here. No one over on DLive today. It's actually the first time that I've put this specific stream on DLive, so it is obviously not what typically is seen on DLive, but that's okay. And again, thank you all very much for being here today. Hopefully to get some videos out. I was just sent a copy of, for those that are fans of the OMB Reviews channel, I just got sent a copy, 4K copy of Spiral, which I haven't seen. Obviously, this got very mixed reviews, so I'm going to be able to watch it myself and be able to give my honest feedback on that. So shout out Lionsgate for sending that my way. But yeah, anyway, you guys are great. I love you guys, bottom of my heart. You're fantastic, wonderful, and amazing people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Never stop fighting. Never stop speaking the truth. Remember to be patient. Remember to be kind. Remember to have self-control. Remember that love is what is going to change the world around us, and not hatred and not anger. All of us need to work on that. Love is the answer. Sometimes that's tough love, but love nonetheless is the answer. Love you guys. Have a wonderful day. And as always, continue to look at the news in both a critical and a cynical fashion. And God bless. And now for a huge shout out to all of my July Patreon and Subscribestar members: Andrew Hoyle, Biffer de Hobbit, Brian P., Dion, Don Bruno de la Mancha, Father Christopher Miller, hail to you, Father, Father Damian Cook, Garrett Searles, Harold Francis, Inflamed Wood, It's a Trap Productions, Jason Clark, Jacob Juice, Jeffrey Toone, Jonathan Carney, Laura the Modern Major General's Story, Mike Jackson, Mad Mitch Dunaway, Mr. Peabody and his evil twin with the beautiful hair, On to June, Orange Hat Reviews, Out of Step with Reality, Priscilla Hall, Riff Magos, Rosetta Allen, Teresa Martin, Theodore Bendon, Tina B, and Tina Bojan. Thank you all very much for supporting me over on Patreon, and also to my Subscribestar members: Fast Reaction, Nosferatu Gatsu, John B, Perpetual Punster, Mr. Roy, Glinzer, J. Alex McCarthy Jr., Dean Heiss / the new number 2, J. Ra the Beer Guru, and ZK Man. And I also want to make sure to shout out my Locals members. I am now available over at locals.com, and I've got 2 monthly supporters over there. The first of my local supporters is Goblin Squatch. Shout out to you, good sir. And also, I now have a second supporter over on locals.com, and that is Robert Barnes. Shout out to both of you very much. Thank you very much for supporting me on that new platform at the Keeper of the Bifrost level. If you want to find out more information about that, go check out my Locals page. You can find the link in the description, and it tells you everything that you would get in that Keeper of the Bifrost level, which is right now the only level available on that platform. And I also want to make sure to shout out any new Patreon members, and for right now, I want to shout out Mondo Spieler, who is my newest member over on Patreon. Thank you all very much for being here today. And if you want to have your name shouted out at the end of every single live stream and video on the channel, please make sure to check out the links in the description of ways that you can support me over on Patreon and Subscribestar as well. It gives you access to things like giveaways of Blu-rays, 4Ks, and digital codes. Also, access to a podcast that I do with John the Flick Pick Flickinger, where we have a lot of fun. We also answer Q&A questions as well. And also you might get access to the Chosen of Valhalla level, which gives you access to a once-a-month podcast exclusively where I bring on you to the main channel with everyone else who is at the level, and we all just talk about movies, pop culture, and tons of fun stuff like that. And also, of course, Tina, who is the Empress of the Universe, is going to give us tons of reviews of movies and also maybe a couple of awesome rants here and there as well. So if that sounds fun to you, make sure you go ahead and check out those links. Again, you're all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.